Minutes until showtime.
The New World Order does not mean surrendering our national sovereignty or forfeiting our interests.
Of course it does. But we aren't going to let that happen. All right. Welcome to Blog TV, Blog Talk Radio, Talk Show, Crusade, and of course the Free American. And the show will go live here. Nice lady will tell me in about 5 seconds.
Sounds good.
Okay, waiting for host. I'm here.
Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American Hour. I'm your host, Clay Douglas. And my guest today is David Stokes. Hello, David.
Hello. How you doing, Clay?
I'm doing pretty good. David, I've just been reading your bio, and I see that you've really overcome a lot of adversity. You grew up in the suburbs of Detroit.
I guess you could say that, yeah. You know, it really wasn't a bad place to grow up back then. I would certainly not want to raise my kids or see my grandkids grow up there, and I still have a great affection for all things Michigan and Detroit, including my Tigers, but I'm sort of glad I moved away at 18 and never looked back.
Yeah, where are you now?
Fairfax, Virginia, just outside D.C., another garden spot. How about that?
Oh, yeah, I've always had...
I lived in the New York City area for a dozen years or so, too.
I've always had a lot of fans there in that area. Langley, I had more subscribers in Langley than I did Dallas.
Yeah, I've been able there a few times. Have a lot of friends and congregants that work there, and have great regard for what they do.
Now you're a radio broadcaster too. You're a columnist, and you've written a book.
I'm ADD, so I got to keep myself interested.
You've written a book, The Shooting Salvationist.
Yes, sir.
And I've just, let me just give our audience an overview. That's the story of J. Frank Norris and the murder trial that captivated America. But you say this is maybe the most famous story you never heard. In the 1920s, the Reverend J. Frank Norris rallied against vice and conspiracies he saw everywhere to a congregation of more than 10,000 at the First Baptist Church at Fort Worth, Texas, where I was born. That was the largest congregation in America, the first megachurch. Norris controlled a radio station, a tabloid, newspaper, valuable tract of land in downtown Fort Worth, and was constantly at odds with the oil boomtown's civic leaders. He aggressively defended his activism, observing John the Baptist was into politics. Now, I never heard of J. Frank Norris before.
Now, did you grow up in Fort Worth, or were you born there?
I did grow up in Fort Worth. Yes,
That's very interesting because in the story of Fort Worth, he is probably one of the most famous people. But, you know, a lot of people have wanted to forget about him. I mean, he was, if you were around Fort Worth, Texas in the 1920s, people knew more about J. Frank Norris than they knew about Amon Carter, who was the owner of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I mean, nationally, that's the way it was. It's one of those stories that's hiding in plain sight in history. He was the ancestor to a lot of the crusading televangelists to come. He was a very larger-than-life kind of character. It's a great Texas story as well as a great American story. He was a good man in some ways, but he was also a flawed man in some ways. He had, of course, this notable story that I write about in the 1926 and 27 when he shot and killed an unarmed critic. And faced the death penalty. They went after him for first-degree murder. That was the indictment, and if he would have been convicted, he would have died in a Texas electric chair, nicknamed Sparky.
That's right. Right there in Huntsville. It's he saw conspiracies. Was this a conspiracy against him, or is that, I'm sure that's the way he saw it.
Well, it's certainly the way he saw it. And, you know, there can be a case to be made. You know, there's a great line from the movie, When Did You Start Getting So Paranoid? And he said, when people started plotting against me. Well, you know, in a sense, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, Norris was a bit of a demagogue. And so in the 1920s, you got to realize that you had the Ku Klux Klan that was a very big entity then, and Norris was friendly with that group. And the big conspiracy that some of these folks saw, in sinister terms, was that Roman Catholicism, not as a theological concept, but as a political, cultural thing, was going to take over America. And so this is, of course, in the 20s, Al Smith, New York governor, ran for president, beaten by Hoover, largely with the help of J. Frank Norris. And so Norris preached about those various conspiracies. But yes, he did feel like there was a conspiracy against him. He believed, that the man who came to warn him to stop speaking about the Friends, in other words, the mayor of Fort Worth, had a friend that went to see Norris. He believed with all of his heart that the mayor and a powerful group of oligarchs in the city of Fort Worth actually sent this man to kill him. And he said as much throughout the prelude to the trial. Now, whether or not that's true is an open question, and I look at that in painful detail when I go into the trial, when I go into the story. But yes, he was a person who was very much preached about conspiracies, but he saw his life in conspiratorial terms. And interestingly enough, as a little footnote, Clay, one of his proteges that he trained in the ministry and sent over to China as a missionary was a young man named John Birch, who was killed in 1945 by Chinese communists, long before the beginning of the John Birch Society, which began in 1958. But it's sort of an interesting little connection between J. Frank Norris and John Birch. That is one of those little footnotes I talk about in the book.
Well, I'm kind of I'm really interested in this man because a lot of the things that he'd done. You know, I've started magazines. I got involved with all of this after I discovered some links to George Bush and the cocaine smuggling going on in Panama and Colombia and Mena, Arkansas. And I've been demonized ever since. You know, I started the militias after what happened at Waco, and I have probably more critics out there than J. Frank Norris did. You know, and I've been called a conspiracy theorist. So I don't think I deal in conspiracy. I deal in facts, and your book is a fact here. So let's get back.
Yeah, it is a fact, but let's think about probably one of the greatest base cluster of conspiracy theories in the 20th century had to do with communism, especially after the end of World War II and we went into the Cold War. And you know, there were all sorts of theories that came about communist control of this, and of course we all know the story of Joseph McCarthy. But here's what's interesting about it, Clay, is that in later years, and in fact in recent years, scholarship, researchers, have actually, you take a guy like Alger Hiss, who was defended by the left wing so much that he really wasn't a communist by even though Whittaker Chambers, and by the way, if people haven't read that great tome by Whittaker Chambers called Witness, it's one of the great books of the 20th century. And yet, here we have evidence now that, hey, guess what? After all, Alger Hiss was a communist spy. The Rosenbergs were, after all, guilty. So, you know, when it comes to conspiracies, you know, America has always had, you know, this active communication, and some would suggest an active imagination, but you know what? Sometimes we find out later that there's a whole lot of there.
Yes. Yes, and you know, I mean, we've got the famous writers. I think writers like you, David, like me, like Ezra Pound, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You know, these they're the people that make the difference in I talk about communism all the time. Every plank on the Communist Manifesto is intact in America today. How is that possible? Every plank.
That's quite a very telling statement. I think that, you know, you take, for instance, I think what it is the 1932 the Socialist Party platform in 1932 had 10 or 12 or 15 items. And they all, without exception, are part and parcel of our average way of life. You think of conservatives in Great Britain, they wouldn't even national health insurance over there because it's part of their national fabric. So things that you know, we get conditioned over time.
I call it the after effects of television. They don't call it programming for nothing.
That's a good way to put it. I agree.
Now, back to J. Frank Norris. The man showed him his office, and they say he was unarmed, but Norris shot him.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the biggest aspects of the story. In Texas, at the time, there was a great popular legal doctrine called apparent danger, not imminent danger, but apparent danger. Now, you got to remember, this is the 1920s. Fort Worth, Texas, you know, notably where the West begins, it says on the masthead of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, it was not far removed from the days of the Old West. This is the time of, not just a couple of decades after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid hung out there in Hell's Half Acre. So you have that attitude towards sort of being wide open with self-defense issues. And there was a legendary move that gets you off oftentimes in a murder trial if you saw that your opponent was making the proverbial hip pocket move, going as if going for a gun. And J. Frank Norris and his defense team, they were brilliant. They successfully argued that he was going for a gun, even though no gun was ever found. And that was the basis of their defense. It's great. It's a very interesting trial. When I researched this thing, and I called it, you know, the most famous story folks have ever heard, I want you to put this in perspective, Clay. You know, think about the pastor of the biggest church in Tucson, or think about Rick Warren, or Joel Osteen, or Pat Robertson, or Jerry Falwell. You know, just name your televangelist du jour, and just for a moment, if one of these guys shot and killed somebody for whatever reason, whatever the facts were, how big a news story would that be? And that's what it was back then. Norris was the pastor of the biggest church in America in 1926, and he did this. And so it was a massive story, and I think that it's one that deserves a full airing and a full telling. And I hope I've done it justice in the book called The Shooting Salvationist. By the way, there's a website that you have graciously linked on your Free American Radio site, and I appreciate that. TheShootingSalvationist.com if people want more information about the book.
Yes, sir. We've got that up and linked, and this show will be linked. And
good.
Yeah, what happened? What happened to this now? This went to trial. This had to be something all the way, national news, as you've stated here. But what happened?
Well, of course, it was national news. Now, in the 1920s was really when news services, wire services, Hearst, AP, UPI, were really getting their traction, and news could get out in a nearly contemporaneous. This was the time when papers would run extras, you know, extra, read all about it. You know, they run 4 or 5 editions a day or an evening. And of course, radio was up and coming. Radio was a primitive medium at the time, but by the time we get towards 1926 or 1927, it's really getting its own. By the way, there's no FCC at this point, so it's a sort of a wide open, no holds barred kind of thing. Well, the trial takes place. The venue is moved from Fort Worth, Texas to Austin, Texas. And I had the privilege of talking about this book on C-SPAN Book TV, and there's a link to that at the shootingsalvationist.com. And I had a talk about it in Austin, Texas, which I found to be an interesting venue for that, because this trial took place in January of 1927 at the same time as the inauguration of the youngest ever and ever since governor of Texas, a guy named Dan the Man Moody. And it became the biggest event in the history of Austin, Texas, those two things up to that point. This trial took place. It took about 10 days to run its course. Norris's defense did a brilliant job, and I mean, anybody who knows the story of Norris knows that he didn't die in the electric chair. He died in 1952 after a good long life, and he was acquitted. But I share many of the reasons in the book for this. It is a great indication of someone who probably was not guilty of first-degree murder, and the great mistake was made, I think, in overreaching. I think he was guilty of overreacting and possibly guilty of manslaughter. But he did beat the rap, as we say, and he went on. What's interesting about this play is he went on to leverage this notoriety into continued success, and eventually pastored two churches at the same time, one in Detroit, Michigan, where I come from, and the other in Fort Worth, Texas, with a combined membership of 25,000, unheard of up to that point. And that church in Detroit, by the way, is where my mother went as a little girl, and that's my connection to the story.
Now, what became of his legacy in Fort Worth? I actually left Fort Worth at a fairly young age, or was thrown out. I'm not sure quite.
Let's put it in perspective. I have really.
I was born in 46. I was born in 46. I left probably in the 60s.
Well, Norris continued to pastor First Baptist Church in downtown Fort Worth at the corner of 4th and Throckmorton Street.
Yes.
Up until 1952 when he died. So you were 6 years of age. And I guarantee you, you had parents and grandparents you knew very well, J. Frank Norris. His church continued to thrive, although went into decline in later years as he went into health decline. He started Bible colleges and seminaries, and he is the father of the independent Baptist movement, independent fundamental Baptist movement in America, that it continued on even through Jerry Falwell and others. So Norris also in the 1940s, he went from being someone who saw the anti-Catholic conspiracy to seeing how vital it was to join hands with the Roman Catholics to fight communism. He even had an audience with Pope Pius V as well, and got a papal blessing. So quite a paradigm shift for the guy. He was a pragmatist. He was a populist. He was a tremendous communicator. Yes, he was a demagogue at times. People have asked me, was he really into saving souls, or was it all about him? And boy, I really can't judge that. I'm a minister myself. I do think that there are a lot of people along the way whose souls got saved under his preaching. I also think a lot of people got hurt, and so I think it's a mixed bag.
Well, one of the problems we have today is how do you fight evil without becoming evil, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good one, yeah. That's a very good observation. Yeah.
We're also told we're doomed to repeat history. We don't learn from it.
Yeah, the great George Santayana, those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. One paraphrase is that the one thing we don't learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And I think that's probably true. And why is that? I think that's because of the fundamental flaws in human nature. And that's where liberalism gets it wrong, because liberalism doesn't make an allowance for individual depravity and sin. It's got to be the environment's fault. It's got to be society's fault. Oh, far be it that anybody's got a fundamental flaw in their emotional or spiritual DNA that makes them a sinner by nature. When you begin with that equation, it's like beginning a series of equations with 2 plus 2 equals 5. It's only one off at the beginning, but by the time you get out there exponentially, it's a big problem. And that's the problem with the world today. People don't want to acknowledge personal, individual sin and this propensity we all have. And as a result, we see what's happening in Britain. We see the flash mobs here because we're just not willing to take it seriously.
I've been reporting on the whole takeover of the New World Order. Now, at this time period, what date did the shooting happen?
1926, the trial was in 27.
The Federal Reserve had just been in power for about 13 years.
Yeah, since 1913.
Did he have anything to say about that? To me, that's the biggest conspiracy ever, and the most successful one. The sun never sets on the English Empire, which was financed by the Rothschilds, the international bankers. Where's all of our gold today? Somehow it ended up in the hands of the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah, Norris certainly was well researched in international affairs and in political philosophy. He's really hard to pin down. He was such a pragmatist and such a populist. He would sort of seize on issues. Certainly in the 1920s, I would think that he was someone who saw big government and big business, I think, in sinister terms. And yet he had a desire to be very big himself. So it's sort of an irony there. I do think that he really tried to reconcile a lot of things that were very hard to reconcile. For instance, the New Deal. In 1932, when Roosevelt was running, J. Frank Norris was pretty much pro-Roosevelt because of the terrible times. But it didn't take him long to turn on Roosevelt. And yet at the same time, when he was pastoring in Detroit, he went toe-to-toe with another radio priest by the name of Father Charles Coughlin, and they were enemies. At one point, it is rumored, and I never found the facts about this because I think it would be hard to find, that even Henry Ford helped to bankroll both J. Frank Norris and a friend of his by the name of Gerald L.K. Smith, to get involved heavily in politics in the 1940s in Detroit.
Well, Ford was well aware of the whole Zionist plan to take over the world. He put copies of the protocols in every Ford.
Yeah, it was the Dearborn Independent. I was actually born in Dearborn, Michigan, so I'm very familiar with the story.
Isn't Dearborn now? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I will say this about Norris: that Norris did a series of sermons in the 20s in one of the few Baptist ministers to call the protocols a forgery, and he preached accordingly in the 1920s. That was a departure from a lot of the Baptist ministers of the day, and Norris was odd mix because he was anti-Catholic, but he was a Zionist, and unabashedly so. In fact, he corresponded with Truman in 1947 and 48. I have copies of the correspondence urging him to eventually, when it happened, recognize the nation state of Israel. So he was I find him, Clay, a fascinating study. He's the ultimate oxymoron. You can't really put him into a peg, because here he is on the one hand a conspiracy theorist, right? He is somebody who sees conspiracies, and on the other hand he is an unabashed Zionist, and that's a pretty odd mix, you got to admit.
Especially at a time when Stalin, Uncle Joe to Roosevelt, was murdering about 60 million white Russian Christians.
Yeah. But he was also an anti-Stalinist. In fact, I have in my files, toward the end of his life, I think it was in 1948-49, J. Frank Norris was invited to address the Texas state legislature, and he gave an address on Americanism. And you can Google this, I think, and find this. And several times in the address, this Baptist preacher said, "To hell with Joe Stalin." And he said it several times there in the House there in the Texas state legislature. So he was a strong anti-communist, and he early on, by the way, in the 1920s, I have sermons from the 1920s, 21, 22, 23, when Lenin was still alive, where he exposes Bolshevism for what it was, when many in this country were still trying to figure out what it was.
Every plank on the Communist Manifesto intact in America today. It kind of brings to mind, well, who won the Cold War anyway?
Good question.
Let me ask you about this Jewish question. You know, I have a book out called Mystery Babylon: New World Order Unveiled. Over 25 years ago, I stumbled across statements from Colonel Edward P. Catolo, Commander of Special Forces, that the George Bush, along with his partner Manuel Noriega, were bringing cocaine in, flying it into a little place called Mena, Arkansas, where the governor was protecting it from the state boys. This is a CIA and Mossad operation. And I put that in my book. But in my book, because the Homeland Security started attacking the Christian identity, another Christian group. And I got into this when the federal government and the BATF attacked a Christian group. This was the Branch Davidians in Waco. This has always been, it's almost like it's always been an attack on Christians. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. And why can't we talk about it? Why aren't the churches talking about this? Now, you made the statement that protocols of the elders of Zion, some people believe they're a forgery. My response to that, what's a forgery? Oh, yeah, that's an exact copy of the original. And whoever wrote them is dead now. What matters is who is using this today. Is this the international banks? Is this the Catholic Church? Is this the Jesuits? Is this the Jews? Is this the state of Israel? Or is this communism? One world, this whole new world order that George Bush, isn't that the same thing as communism? Isn't it the same goals?
When it comes to the protocols, you've got to understand also that the biggest proponents and propagation of the protocols of the elders of Zion, which I do believe are not authentic, is in the Muslim world. They are published voluminously in the radical Muslim world, and it fuels Muslim hatred both for Israel and for the United States of America. The greatest market for that document right now is in the Arab Muslim world. You can read about that in books like Icon of Evil, about the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. During the period of time he was Hitler's favorite jihadist. I've called him in an article that I wrote. And I have written articles for townhall.com on the protocols, and I go into the history of them, and I, that's not the purpose of our discussion today, but I'm on the other side of the fence on that from you.
I don't care who wrote it, they're dead. What I care about is is this a system that's being used to dumb down Americans, are you a 501c3 church? Are there certain things you can't talk about or you lose your tax?
I'm not here as a church. This is my own, so I'm not a 501c3 person.
Okay.
But my church is, and I'm not representing my church right now.
Okay. All right, that's fair enough.
But let me just say that I don't have any problem with looking and talking about big monetary issues and things that don't make sense and don't add up. Where I get uncomfortable is I don't want to throw the whole bugaboo of a vast Jewish conspiracy, because I don't think that's the nature of it. And I do not believe such a thing ever existed. I think it was used originally by the Tsar's Akhrana, was the name of the secret police, long before there was a KGB. And I go into the history of it in a piece called The Great Anti-Semitic Lie That Won't Go Away at townhall.com. You can just Google my name, David R. Stokes, and anti-Semitism or the protocols, and an article will come up that I've written, and whatever one thinks about it. But Norris, going back to Norris, he was an oddball, because he did believe in conspiracies. He did believe in, for instance, he saw a great conspiracy in the 20s that it was going to be Roman Catholicism that was the great threat to American life and culture. And I mean, that was really on his radar, because a Roman Catholic ran for the first time for president in 1928, the New York Governor Al Smith, who ran against Herbert Hoover. And Norris is credited. I've got the telegram in my files from the RNC, Republican National Committee in Chicago, crediting J. Frank Norris with Hoover carrying Texas, the first time a Republican did since Reconstruction. So he's a fascinating guy. I think he was a populist. He was a pragmatist. I think his core belief was about him.